Type 3. The instrumental moralist. Characteristics. The end justifies the means, taken to deadly logical conclusions. Any action justified if it benefits the cause or the greater good. Complete suspension of universal ethical principles in service of political goals. Ability to rationalize increasingly extreme actions as morally necessary. Views traditional moral constraints as weakness or naivety. Neurological markers. Moral reasoning centers of brain consistently overridden by political loyalty centers. No activation in areas associated with moral conflict when contemplating unethical acts for political purposes. Reward centers activate when contemplating harm to opponents. Complete reorganization of moral processing systems around political identity. Type 4. The weaponized believer. Characteristics. Religious or spiritual beliefs completely subordinated to political ideology. Divine authority invoked to justify celebration of opponents' suffering. Complete perversion of spiritual principles to serve political hatred. God or spiritual forces recruited as validators of their darkest impulses. Inability to distinguish between authentic spirituality and political manipulation. Neurological markers. Areas associated with spiritual experience activate when contemplating political violence. Religious devotion and political hatred processed in same brain regions. No distinction between divine will and political preference. Spiritual practices trigger political anger rather than peace or compassion. Type 5. The social sadist. Characteristics. Genuine psychological pleasure derived from opponents' suffering. Compulsive need to humiliate and degrade political enemies. Complete absence of remordimiento or guilt for extreme cruelty. Social media becomes platform for competitive displays of callousness. Escalating need for more extreme expressions of cruelty to maintain psychological satisfaction. Neurological markers. Pleasure centers activate when viewing or contemplating opponents' suffering. Dopamine reward systems hijacked by political cruelty. Tolerance effects requiring increasingly extreme cruelty for same psychological reward. No activation in areas associated with empathy, guilt, or moral restraint. The collective dimension. When society becomes the patient. Understanding mass synchronization of cruelty. What transforms individual psychological pathology into social catastrophe is the phenomenon of mass synchronization. When thousands or millions of people simultaneously experience satisfaction from others' political suffering, we're no longer dealing with individual mental health issues. We're witnessing collective social pathology that threatens the very foundations of civilized society. The network effect of political sadism. Modern social media has created unprecedented opportunities for the rapid spread and amplification of cruel political behavior. What might have remained isolated individual pathology in previous eras now becomes viral collective behavior within hours. The psychological mechanics of viral cruelty. Validation. Feedback loops. Cruel comments receive immediate positive reinforcement through likes and shares. Social media algorithms amplify emotionally provocative content. Competitive dynamics emerge around who can be most callous. Normal moral restraints dissolve in the face of group approval, anonymity, and disinhibition. Online environments reduce accountability for cruel behavior. Physical distance from victims enables psychological distance. Group behavior dilutes individual moral responsibility. Normal social penalties for cruelty don't apply in digital spaces. Echo chamber intensification. Cruel behavior becomes normalized within closed information environments. Moderate voices are driven out or silenced. Extremism becomes the baseline for group membership. Reality testing completely breaks down within group boundaries. Gamification of cruelty. Political suffering becomes entertainment and competition. Points scored through increasingly extreme expressions of callousness. Social status within group determined by willingness to be cruel. Moral behavior becomes associated with weakness and betrayal. The neurological contagion effect. Recent research in social neuroscience has revealed that emotional states, including cruelty and dehumanization, literally spread through social networks like infectious diseases. Mirror neuron systems that normally help us develop empathy instead become conduits for spreading callousness. How cruelty spreads through networks. Viewing cruel behavior activates the same neural networks as performing it. Repeated exposure to cruelty normalizes it at a neurological level. Group membership becomes associated with demonstrating cruelty. Empathetic responses become suppressed through social pressure. Brain chemistry changes to reward group-approved cruel behavior. The tipping point phenomenon. Societies don't gradually slide into collective cruelty. They reach tipping points where the behavior rapidly becomes universal within political groups. Research suggests this tipping point occurs when approximately 15–20% of a group begins actively celebrating political violence. Signs of approaching social tipping point. Cruel political behavior becomes socially acceptable rather than shameful. Moderate voices within political groups are systematically silenced. Media coverage normalizes or celebrates political violence. Institutional leaders fail to consistently condemn political cruelty. Legal system begins treating political opponents differently than allies. Educational institutions become venues for political indoctrination rather than critical thinking. The point of no return. Once collective cruelty becomes normalized within significant segments of society, the psychological infrastructure necessary for democracy begins to collapse. Democratic governance requires that citizens view political opponents as legitimate participants in shared governance, not as enemies to be destroyed. Markers of democratic psychological collapse. Public celebration of political opponents' suffering becomes routine. Institutional protection extended only to political allies. Legal system weaponized against political opponents. Media landscape completely polarized with no shared factual baseline. Civil society organizations forced to choose political sides to survive. Educational curriculum redesigned to serve political rather than educational goals. Religious institutions subordinated to political ideology. Family relationships destroyed over political disagreements. Historical pattern. Recognition. Lessons from democracy's graveyard. Laboratories of authoritarianism. How democracies die. This dynamic isn't new, and that's what makes it so terrifying. History provides us with detailed case studies of how entire populations developed collective cruelty capacity under authoritarian leadership. The patterns are so consistent that political scientists can now predict democratic breakdown with alarming accuracy. What's most chilling is that the same psychological techniques that worked in 1930s Germany work just as effectively in 21st century democracies. Human psychology hasn't evolved. Only the tools for manipulating it have become more sophisticated. Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1945. The blueprint for democratic destruction. The progression, 1933-1935. Normalization of discrimination against undesirable groups. 1935-1938. Legal system weaponized to remove rights from targeted populations. 1938-1941. Violence against targeted groups becomes socially acceptable. 1941-1945. Industrial-scale elimination of human beings becomes state policy. Key psychological mechanisms. Ordinary citizens actively celebrating deportations and disappearances of Jewish neighbors. Gradual normalization of dehumanization through propaganda and peer pressure. Active participation by educated society sectors including doctors, teachers, and professionals. Complete moral inversion where cruelty became patriotic duty. Social pressure to demonstrate loyalty through increasing callousness toward designated enemies. The role of good Germans. The most important lesson from Nazi Germany isn't about the committed ideologues. It's about the millions of ordinary people who went along with escalating cruelty because it became socially expected. These weren't monsters. They were neighbors, colleagues, and family members who gradually lost their moral compass through social pressure and propaganda. Pinochet's Chile, 1973-1990. The middle-class embrace of brutality. The progression, 1973-1975. Military coup celebrated as necessary to prevent communist takeover. 1975-1978. Disappearances and torture justified as unfortunate but necessary for national security. 1978-1983. Systematic human rights violations normalized as patriotic duty. 1983-1990. Complete social division between those who celebrated state violence and those who opposed it. Key psychological mechanisms. Middle sectors actively applauding disappearances of communists and terrorists. Moral justification of torture and murder as defense of civilization. Complicit silence from institutions meant to protect human rights. Religious institutions recruited to provide moral cover for state violence. Social segregation between supporters and opponents of the regime. The banality of evil. Chilean middle-class support for Pinochet's brutality demonstrated how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic human rights violations when they're convinced it serves a greater good. Professional associations, women's groups, and business organizations actively supported policies they knew involved torture and murder. Chavista Venezuela, 1999-present. The slow-motion democratic collapse. The progression, 1999 to 2004. Democratic institutions gradually captured and weaponized. 2004-2009. Media landscape polarized and independent journalism systematically destroyed. 2009-2014. Opposition politicians persecuted and civil society suppressed. 2014 present. Complete authoritarian control maintained through violence and manipulation. Key psychological mechanisms. Public celebration of opponent persecution and suffering. Complete moral inversion where victims are portrayed as victimizers. Progressive degradation of collective moral sensitivity through constant propaganda. Social pressure to demonstrate loyalty through cruelty toward opponents. International isolation justified as resistance to foreign interference. The gradual nature of democratic death. Venezuela demonstrates how democracies die gradually, not suddenly. Each step in the authoritarian process seems reasonable in isolation, but the cumulative effect is the complete destruction of democratic governance. By the time citizens realize what's happened, the psychological and institutional infrastructure necessary to resist has been systematically dismantled. Contemporary parallels. The universal nature of democratic breakdown. What makes these historical cases relevant isn't their specific ideological content. It's the universal psychological patterns they reveal. Whether the justifying ideology is fascist, communist, or populist, the underlying psychological techniques remain remarkably consistent. Universal patterns in democratic breakdown. Polarization. Amplification. Normal political differences are artificially amplified into existential conflicts. Institutional capture. Democratic institutions are gradually transformed into weapons against opponents. Media weaponization. Information landscape is polarized to eliminate shared factual baseline. Social pressure campaigns. Citizens pressured to demonstrate loyalty through cruelty toward opponents. Legal system politicization. Law enforcement becomes tool of political control rather than justice. Civil society destruction. Independent organizations forced to choose sides or face elimination. Moral inversion. Traditional moral principles inverted to serve political power. Historical weaponization. Past grievances used to justify contemporary violence. International isolation. Outside criticism dismissed as foreign interference. Final stage violence. Physical elimination of opponents becomes state policy. The acceleration effect. Each historical case shows that democratic breakdown accelerates as it progresses. What begins as seemingly minor violations of democratic norms quickly escalates to systematic persecution and violence. The psychological infrastructure necessary for genocide or mass murder doesn't require decades to build. It can be constructed in months or years through systematic manipulation of normal human psychology. The role of technology in modern democratic breakdown. Contemporary threats to democracy have access to tools that historical authoritarians could only dream of. Social media algorithms that amplify outrage and division. Sophisticated psychological profiling for targeted manipulation. 24/7 information warfare capabilities. Global networks for sharing authoritarian techniques. Economic warfare tools for punishing opponents. Surveillance technology for monitoring and controlling populations. These tools don't change the underlying psychology of democratic breakdown, but they dramatically accelerate and amplify the process. What took years in previous eras can now happen in months or even weeks. Neuroscience of political hatred. What happens in the brain? Recent research in political neuroscience shows that extreme polarization literally alters brain structure. Documented neurological changes. Hyperactivation of amygdala, fear and aggression center. Reduced activity in prefrontal cortex, moral judgment area. Altered empathy systems toward groups considered enemies. Neurological addiction to information confirming prejudices. The result? People who would be empathetic and rational in normal contexts literally lose neurological capacity to feel compassion for political opponents. Implications for democratic future. Democracy requires basic empathy. A functional democratic system requires citizens to recognize basic humanity in political opponents. When significant population sectors lose this capacity, democracy enters terminal territory. Signs of democratic collapse. Public celebration of political opponents' harm. Moral justification of violence against enemies of the people. Institutional silence regarding political violence escalation. Social normalization of systematic dehumanization. Conclusion. The mirror we don't want to see. What we've witnessed in various countries recently isn't normal politics. It's developing social psychopathology. Citizens celebrating political violence represents the death of collective empathy, a fundamental prerequisite of any civilized society. The final question isn't whether these patterns are concerning. They clearly are. The question is whether societies are willing to confront this reality before it's too late. Because ultimately, a society that celebrates political violence is a society that has already lost its democratic soul. Everything that follows are merely formal procedures of collapse. Are we witnessing the birth of authoritarian regimes or the awakening of societies that can still save themselves? Time to decide is running out.